Hello, everyone. So nice to see a full crowd. Happy pre-Shana Tova. What a lineup, right? They don't need me here. I said to my husband, who's going to be on the panel, he said, what are you doing there? Welcome, everyone. We're going to start with Sarah, because this night is about you, Sarah. Oh. But you have some very good friends supporting you and bringing you extra luster. I just want to first, full disclosure, all the connections. You went to college, freshman year?
With Dara, yeah. For 30 years, actually. We met in a pre-freshman orientation program literally 30 years ago last week.
Yes. Wow. And were you as Jewy then?
Nope.
Dara, any memories of Sarah before we start that you want to share? This is a safe space.
Yeah. Sarah's been amazing for 30 years. That's all I have to say. I'm just, I feel so lucky to have known her for so long.
Oh, thank you, my friend.
And obviously, some of you have heard of Dan, and I hope some of you listen to his podcast if you haven't heard of it. I was saying Dan doesn't need any more compliments, but it really is true on a serious note that you really have, I think, become, in many ways, our compass and our clarity through a very impossible time. So I thank you for that. So, Sarah, let's start with the why of this book. I hope people read your first, but just give us a little bit of the trajectory, what led you to this. And you said the first book was a love letter, and this is a polemic, so...
Yeah, it's been a change.
Why
before I do this, I just have to, I know we shouldn't do all the throat clearing, but the three people on this stage could each fill this room themselves. And they are here because they are mensches, because they are generous, and they are actually three of my earliest teachers of Judaism. Like, I read their books, I think before I knew you, Abby, and before I knew, I read their books, and you were my early teachers. So to be on stage with these people it's really a dream come true, and I am just very, very grateful. Just needed to say that because it's very important to me.
This is an affirmation circle, and eventually...
We're not actually going to talk about the book. We're just going to talk about each other.
That's it.
We're going to have a little rugala.
I hope that's not awkward, but it... So, yeah, I really did go from a love letter to a polemic. And what happened was, my last book was about rediscovering Judaism at the age of 36. After being a young person who kind of saw Judaism as like a few holidays, 3 boring ones, 1 fun one, Hanukkah, 2 texts, prayer book in my hand, the scrolls with the Torah, whatever that was, didn't really understand, and a handful of like universalist values like don't lie, cheat, steal, help the poor. And I had a very apologetic Jewish identity, like I'm Jewish, but not that Jewish. Oh no, I'm a cultural Jew, knowing nothing about Jewish culture. By the way, nothing at all, which is too bad because it's great to be a cultural Jew if you know something about Jewish culture. I did not. Or like I'm a social justice Jew. Also beautiful, but you gotta know something about what Judaism says about social justice. So my Jewish identity was really like a series of caveats and apologies and kind of like a little, like almost like an ethnic joke. Like, haha, I'm anxious. Haha, that's my Judaism, or I have edgy humor. And then, I rediscovered Judaism. I write this book that's such a love letter. I'm so happy to share it all. And, back then I was like, oh, where has this been all my life? So fun. I write the book. And a few things happened. Number one, I read Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews, and it radicalized me. If you haven't read it, I don't know where you've been. It is a critical book.
Required reading.
The canon. And that I was like, wait a second. This is interesting. And then I trained to be a hospital chaplain,
And before we get to the hospital chaplain, I want to make it clear that when you wrote the first book, which I know is not what we're talking about, but you took an incredibly deep dive of self-education. I mean, you were interviewing rabbis, you were studying every text. In a sense, you said you were doing the work for your reader. I think the Torah is just one chapter of that book. It's like literally this is the canvas of Jewish thought, of Jewish liturgy, just so people have to understand the rigor of that first book.
It was several thousand hours of learning. So, I trained to be a hospital chaplain just as a volunteer, and people were like, chaplain? That's Christian, right? Can you do that as a Jew? And it made me realize how often we think that things that are universal, they're actually Christian. I mean, even in chaplaincy classes, we were like, let's discuss our ministry. And prayer is like, God, please heal my friend Dara, who's right here and can hear me praying spontaneously. I was told, like, everyone prays that way. And I'm like, I don't know if Jews really do. And they were like, no, that's universal. And I began to think about how much I sort of thought and spoke in Christian language. Even spirituality, the idea that our bodies are kind of like inferior and carnal and kind of material, whereas there's a heavenly spirit realm that's better. That body-soul duality is not such a Jewish idea. It's like, that's interesting. And then I visited a college campus about a year before October 7th. And the students at the Hillel there they asked me how I dealt with anti-Semitism when I was in college. And I was so stunned. Because when Dara and I were in college in the 90s, there just wasn't anti-Semitism there. And I started thinking, what was the deal with the Judaism I grew up with? Where had this been all my life? Why was it so oddly edited? And so I took this deep dive into history and kind of discovered that my Jewish identity had very much been infiltrated and warped by 2,000 years of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and 200 years of Jews very understandably trying to escape that persecution by erasing themselves, by assimilating, by leaving behind traditions that the people around them found repulsive. And, this book is my account of discovering that and trying to strip away those layers of self-hatred, of shame, of internalized anti-Semitism in order to reclaim Jewish tradition on Jewish terms and on my own terms.
And I want to bring you in, Dan, here, because on the 92nd Street Y stage, you gave the State of World Jewry. Is that the title of the lecture?
Not my title, by the way. That's their title. I wouldn't have been so presumptuous to say I'm delivering.
But a very impactful speech, and people should watch it.
They should.
It's actually hard to find a transcript of it online. You might want to fix that. You really emphasized kind of doubling down on Jewish education. And I want you to talk about, sometimes that seems like we should know more. Why do you feel so, maybe evangelical is the wrong term, about that? And how have you seen that play out in your own life?
Yeah, I will say I came to this view long before I worked on that speech. And when I came to this view, which I'll talk about in a moment, I felt very much alone. It was well after October 7th. And I felt this, in a sense, October 7th, or October 8th for that matter, what sort of crowdsourced a lot of anti-Semitism, as we have seen, but it also crowdsourced a lot of Jews. A lot of Jews came to the surface that were not really engaged in Jewish life in any way, and suddenly they were pumped, they were motivated, they were ready to get organized, they were ready to go, and I was very moved by it at the beginning. And then over time, I realized that all of this energy was being directed to the fight, as though the totality of Jewish engagement in a post-October 7th world was about fighting the anti-Semites. And, and I would see this play out, because I'm sure like many people in this room, you're in these WhatsApp groups, what my wife calls the "can you believe" WhatsApp groups. And we're all in them, okay? And the reason she calls them that is because all people do is circulate. Can you believe that BBC article? Can you believe what Christiane Amanpour said tonight? And you circulate it in your WhatsApp group, and then what everyone does is then they take it and they circulate it to all their other WhatsApp groups, and this thing goes, and that is all this energy. And at some point it hit me that this was not Jewish engagement, this was Jewish adrenaline. And at some point, the adrenaline, it's just not sustainable. Here we are 2 years in, right? It's not sustainable. And if what comes after October 7th is just that, there's no real gain in Jewish life. And the real gain in Jewish life is like a real diaspora Jewish renaissance. And that can only come not just from fighting the anti-Semites, although we have to fight the anti-Semites too, but it comes from actually introducing and cultivating the sense of community and joy and ritual and literacy of Jewish life and of being a Jew for young Jews. And that's the only way you get continuity. If you go back century after century after century after century, every century there's terrible anti-Semitism. In many of the centuries, the Jews fought back. But that's not the reason there's Jewish continuity. The real reason there's Jewish continuity is because there was fighting back, but it was undergirded by a decision to live Jewish lives. And I felt that was not the focus, is on living Jewish lives. And so Jewish education. Well, let me say this. I started to look at what works in terms of Jewish living and Jewish continuity, and the only proven models that I could find are where young Jews are in bubble experiences, deeply immersive experiences with other Jews, like Jewish day schools, Jewish summer camps, gap years. You know, there's some shorter programs like Birthright. I can come up with a bunch of examples. But those are the proven models, and we, after October 7th, should be tripling, quadrupling our investment in that.
And
I just want to say one other thing. And I mean, when I say I felt alone, I mean, ultimately I gave the speech and it resonated clearly, but many months before that, as Sarah will know, I was coming to this view, and it was kind of like an unpopular view. That's not what people wanted to hear. They wanted to hear, like, we're storming the streets to fight. You know, that's what they want. And I remember one night, I don't know if you remember this, I was listening to something Sarah said, or a speech she gave, or a podcast, and I emailed her. And because I was like toying with this idea, and we went back and forth, and we were like completely aligned. And she said, well, I'm actually working on a book about this. And I thought, wow, maybe you should send me the manuscript. And I thought, wait a minute, no, because then I'll turn that into my speech. So I'm glad you didn't send it to me. But so many of the themes in your book, well, I mean, clearly, if you read the speech and you know Sarah's book, a lot of what she has been thinking about shaped my thinking on this.
And Sarah, before you go, I just want to, because part of what I think Dan said that sometimes daunts people is day school. Like, it's just not going to necessarily be where a lot of, even my cohort, frankly, and full disclosure, I'm at Central Synagogue and a proud member, but not a lot, I think, of my fellow congregants are necessary. Some are, not all are going to go to day school, the majority aren't. I think one of the things that you kind of give us access to and seem to believe in is that giving yourself Jewish confidence has to start with Jewish learning. And I just would love you to kind of just articulate that and how this book gets at that before I go to Dara.
Yeah, I mean, and also just, you know, in response to what Dan said, you can't fight anti-Semitism if you don't have Jewish learning. This is kind of a fundamental piece. If someone says to you, Judaism is, you know, a religion with an angry, vengeful God, and it's weedy and legalistic and unloving, if you don't know anything about Jewish tradition, what are you going to say? Like, I love kugel. You know, it's like, that's not really an answer. If, like, they say, you know, Israel is a colonial racist state, and you don't know Israel, the history of Israel, what, you're going to just say that you're like, haha, I'm anxious? These are, you know, being just a cultural Jew and knowing nothing about Jewish culture, you can't fight anti-Semitism. And I will say, you know, people, like, the reality is there are so many different ways to be a proud, passionate, committed Jew, so many different ways to practice, but I think that one of those ways is not being contentless. I think Contentless. I think knowing absolutely nothing about the tradition is actually not a great way to be a Jew. And I'll tell you, this is really hard because so many of us grow up with this very basic childhood Judaism. We go to Hebrew school, you know, we have a bar bat mitzvah, and then we're kind of done. And then we have kids and are like, uh-oh, somebody better make this kid Jewish. I will fob this off on some poor Hebrew school teacher and expect them to make my kid Jewish in 2 hours a week. Doesn't work. Like, the reality is we have to break the cycle by growing up. We have to become adult Jews. And by we, I mean I had to become an adult Jew. And guys, this isn't a tradition where you, like, take something into your heart and are transformed. I know we think that because we live in a Christian country. This is a tradition where you have to study. You've got to learn. You got to read some books, take some classes. However you learn, listen to some lectures. I don't care how you do it. Have hands-on experiences, travel, but you have to actually know the basics of Jewish history, text, thought, traditions, rituals, even to know what to do with it. And so I think that breaking that kind of pediatric Judaism cycle it's very challenging.
Dara, part of what I think is so important about Sarah's book, among many things, is that she says the pre-Holocaust history of persecution is often, first of all, never learned, and second of all, would actually change the way any student or frankly, any person would look at the current moment we're in. It's not, people often think that that's kind of where our story begins, our foundational story. Can you just address, because you've talked so much about this?
Yes. So, first of all, yes, it's such an honor to be here. I'm really, really thrilled to be on the stage with all of you, and especially Sarah. If you haven't ordered your book, what are you waiting for? Go on Amazon right now and buy her book.
Not right now.
Well, maybe not right now. Whenever you turn back your phone back on, go buy her book. It will blow your mind. so a lot of what Sarah and Dan are talking about the importance of learning this, this is something I thought about a lot. I mean, so since I wrote People Love Dead Jews, I've become what one of my sisters calls me the anti-Semitism Lorax, which is that basically I'm like little guy yelling over here that no one's listening to, except every Jew is telling me their horror stories. So this is and the big thing that people kept asking me was, I made this stupid error where when you write a nonfiction book about a problem, people expect you to solve the problem at the end of the book. And so I had all these people being like, so what's your solution to this problem? And my totally tasteless reply is, do you really want me to give you the final solution to the Jewish question? Because that was not what I was planning to do. But, which is in fact the title of my next book, which I'm working on right now, I'm not even kidding. But then it was, you were saying about Holocaust education, I did this project for The Atlantic, which came out actually before October 7th in early 2023, about Holocaust education in America. And that got me starting to think about, what you both are talking about is education within the Jewish community. I started thinking about what do people in the broader community know about Jews? And it was this really striking thing that you realize that, there's, however many states in this country where children K-12 schools are required to learn that Jews are people who died in Europe between 1933 and 1945, and the reason we have to learn about that is because it's going to teach you how to be a nice person or something like that. They're not required to learn anything else. And I want to be really clear, I'm not against Holocaust education. However many states it is, it should be 50. But I remember being in the Dallas Holocaust Museum, talking to the docents there, and I said, what do the kids usually ask when they come through this museum? And they said, you know what they ask? They say, are there still Jews alive today? Because if you were in this museum, you wouldn't know. And I was like, that means that we're outsourcing teaching who Jews are to TikTok. And we're living with the results. And, so you said about teaching this pattern of before the Holocaust, it's also about after the Holocaust, right? Because, many people are totally comfortable talking about Jews as long as we stop at 1945, right? Because then nobody's implicated now. I actually, I was sort of fired up about this after I had a horrible experience at on this, Anti-Semitism Advisory Committee on the former president of our alma mater who, didn't take a lot of my advice. It was so bad that I got called into Congress to testify about it. It was awesome. But what this made me realize is college too late. I actually have recently founded a nonprofit, whose purpose is to educate a broader American public about who Jews are, starting in K-12 schools. So, and because I feel like this is something that is essential for all Americans to know. Because I don't understand why we're teaching people that Jews are people who died in Europe between 1933 and 1945. Because the reality is you can't understand civilization without understanding Judaism, right? Jews are not bit players in world history, right? It's you can't understand Christianity, you can't understand Islam, you can't understand the Enlightenment, you can't understand so much of the world we live in without understanding the basics of Jewish civilization. So I'll leave it there. There's a lot.
It's called the Living Tell Foundation.
Yeah, it's called the Tell Institute. I don't have the website yet. It's about to go up, but if you're an educator and you're interested in this project, please let me know. So
please do.
I also think then go buy her book.
I would also argue that Holocaust education too often is understood as anti-Semitism education. And my experience was I learned that the Germans lost World War I and they blamed the Jews. And then there was the Depression and they blamed the Jews and then they killed them. And it's why the Jews? Well, because of prejudice and scapegoating. It's oh, okay. And they're but why the Jews? Because of prejudice and scapegoating. That's what we're learning. The real answer to that question, which has been this answer I got entirely from Christian scholars who've really carefully looked into this, the answer is 2,000 years of Christian anti-Judaism, which wore neural grooves into the Western world's mind about Jewish power, depravity, and conspiracy that led to the kind of thinking that led to the Holocaust. This is just mainstream Christian scholarship. But try teaching that in an American public school, right? You really, that's not... We're a country where if you say happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas, people get mad. You can't really do that. And so I think a lot of people kind of think anti-Semitism is it's a mystery. Just baked into the order of the universe. It's a mystery. It's not. right? Like we can trace this through history quite clearly, and my book highlights many Christian scholars who did just that. And I think I worry Holocaust education. It doesn't really teach you what led to the Holocaust, and B, it really does not suffice as anti-Semitism education.
I want to come back to something you say about your friends, your contemporaries, who would never think about Jewish day school. That's partly our failure, that we make it so inaccessible to so many people. And if there really is going to be a renaissance in Jewish learning and Jewish education, this is the time to get creative about how to introduce different ways for Jews to access it. And it's reminded me of a point that Sarah's made, and I can't remember if it was in your last book or this book or in the conversations, it's all like a blur, but you should still buy the most recent book, is Sarah's made the point that we almost cap, like we end the idea of Jewish learning at a child's bar or bat mitzvah. We say, okay, you're done now. Now, like you've done Judaism, and now you go on with everything else. And this idea that like at the exact moment when actually young people are about to enter this stage in life where they're going to be the most curious, they're going to be certainly the most intellectually curious, they're going to start asking all these questions, that's when we say, no, not now. And then these kids get to college and they're signing up for classes on like Buddhist philosophy, and they're so inspired, how thoughtful, how interesting. And you're like, you know, we have some good stuff too. And like, but we actually make them think they're done learning it at age 12 or 13. And that is madness. And I think so much of what Sarah's accomplished in both of her books is making this content accessible in a way that I think it could really engage young people to start getting curious about it and not just be taking Buddhist philosophy
Sarah,
classes in
thank you
college.
for saying that.
So this, we are very much in agreement on this. I also think this reflects a much bigger problem, which actually involves our reckoning with how we entered modernity. And this is actually sort of a key point that I make in my book. And Dara writes, I basically quote Dara in like every chapter, but especially the chapter on this, I quote Dara, which is that in Western Europe, when Jews were finally allowed to be citizens, you know, they had to go from living in these insular Jewish communities where they were 24/7 Jews, and they had to figure out how to be Frenchmen and Germans. And they did something pretty courageous. They didn't just ditch Judaism. They didn't become Christians. They invented a kind of Judaism that would let them assimilate into the broader world. They went from being Jew as like your 24/7 existence to Judaism is a Protestant-style religion. As Dara beautifully puts it, it's like, we're just like you, we just go to a different church. And that kind of explained to me the very edited kind of Judaism I grew up with, that it kind of had a Protestant shape to it in some ways. You know, one of the heartbreaking things I think we did is that we downplayed our post-biblical textual tradition. 2,500 years of commentary and debate and scholarship that really is the beating heart of Judaism, but Christians in Europe thought it was disgusting. They didn't have that. So we were like, no, we're prophetic Jews. We're just prophetic morality. We love that Old Testament that we share with you, just like you, different church. And the problem is, with day school, I was talking to someone about this, and I made a comment which maybe was a little insensitive, but I said, I think it's hard to give your kid a really solid Jewish education without sending them to day school. Just because if I don't have kids, but if I did, I don't know how I would do that. I'm just not sure how I would do it. And she got very upset and was like, no, I went to Hebrew school, I did Hebrew high school, I got a good Jewish education. And I was thinking, wow, how did they teach you, history and Hebrew and Gemara and all this stuff in, just a few hours a week? But I realized we were talking about two different things because she, I think for her, Judaism was similar to, she grew up sort of similarly to me, so I don't think she necessarily knew all of this stuff, right? I didn't know that we had a post-biblical textual tradition. Who knew? No idea that that's actually the beating heart of Judaism. I didn't know there was Jewish history or culture. If you grew up like I did, then you really don't need Jewish day school to learn 4 holidays, 3 universalistic values, and 2 texts.
Sarah, I just want to sort of separate 2 things I'm hearing, and I think they run through the book. One is that because you described Jewish survival, sort of forced us to kind of water things down, essentially hide, play things down. Then there's the other piece, which has a little more culpability, a little more agency, which is probably kind of more my generation because I'm older than yours, which is kind of it's more social justice oriented. I'm not saying I don't think it was contentless. I'm not going to throw my parents under the bus. But you are kind of indicting a generation that let it go.
See, the thing is, though, I don't blame anyone because, like, why? Again, you're sort of yelling at people for not embracing Jewish content when they've never seen Jewish content. You know, if your only contact points with Judaism are 2 high holy day services you don't really understand, a kind of half-hearted Seder and a Hanukkah party, why would you think that Judaism has thousands of years of wisdom about how to be human? Like, you haven't seen it, so like I really can't blame people. I can't yell at people because they didn't even know it was there, which is why, like, why send your kid to day school if you don't even know the stuff they need to learn? Like, we have such a fundamental threshold problem. Like, if you grew up like I did, day school seems like chauvinistic. What, you're separating them out just to learn 4 values and 5 holidays? Like, why would you do that? It's like...
Sarah, I want to just read a quote, actually, so people can also hear your voice and have also the others respond. I now understand how centuries of lies about my tradition had driven me away from it, how lenses imposed on it by others had distorted and demeaned it, how my ignorance and arrogance were in part the result of a generations-long persecution and trauma-induced spiritual erasure. That's a pretty big indictment.
I did say, I actually, the original read spiritual suicide, but I thought that was too harsh, so I toned it down.
So before you elucidate, maybe Dara, do you want to respond to?
Yes, well, because, you know, what Sarah, I think, is really saying in that passage you read and really throughout the book is that what
I just want to make sure, because everyone's talking very fast on this stage. Are you with them? Okay.
Excellent, yes. Everyone
people.
can keep
We're
up.
fast talkers.
We're going to keep up. What you're saying, though, is quite the opposite of what you, Abby, were suggesting, because you were saying, oh, there's this culpability, there's this generation that dropped the ball, or several. And then you seem just now to be sort of enforcing that by being like, oh, people don't know what they're missing. That's actually, you're saying something much more serious in the book, which is more similar to the quote that Abby just read, which is that this wasn't freely chosen.
Correct.
Yes, this was not freely chosen. This was, like, the reason that there are these generations that basically knew nothing is because of this internalized anti-Semitism that comes from this choice that a previous generation made about how are we going to protect ourselves, right? And also, like, this sort of, when you have this sort of dominant society that is, like, yelling at you in every possible way that your tradition is repulsive, you know, like, this goes under your skin in ways that you don't realize. It goes into the people who are your parents, your teachers, the people in your community. And what I think is really interesting is the choices that previous generations made. You know, and this is actually something I'm writing about in my next book. You know, now we often will talk about, like, oh, there was this, like, you know, holiday from history for the past 50 years, you know, and after the Holocaust, you know, people felt bad about being anti-Semitic, and so they stopped for a while, and it became a taboo, and then, you know, like, we made this. That's not what happened. Actually, that line about we go to a different kind of church, it wasn't my line. It's actually from the movie Gentleman's Agreement, and that movie came out in 1948. About anti-Semitism in America. And 1948, there's still signs everywhere that said no dogs and Jews allowed. And, you know, and there's redlining, and you can't get a job unless you change your name, and you can't, you know, rent an apartment in this neighborhood, and you can't get this, you know, and you can't go, it's not about a country club, it's about, like, a job. Like, these are, like, life-changing things. And I put a podcast episode about that film and a couple of years ago, and it was only after I put out that podcast that my own parents told me about their experiences growing up with this kind of thing. And, like, my parents are in their 70s. I've known my parents my entire life. And no, they never mentioned this to me. Like, so this idea that, like, this was, like, totally fine, you know, after 1945, this all just stopped, you know, all the non-Jews suddenly felt bad about it. No, how did it change? American Jewish activism. American Jewish activism, like writing those books about anti-Semitism, making those movies, and then there was a follow-on, and I will plug another friend's book, my friend Rachel Gordon, who's teaches Jewish history at University of Florida. She has a book called Post-War Stories about this, where she talks about, like, this effort that a lot of American Jewish intellectuals in the middle of the 20th century made into sort of kind of rebranding Judaism as an American religion. So people like Milton Steinberg, who was the rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue, who put out all these, like, Life magazine articles about Judaism, and this was sort of a moment in American life where religion was, like, the cool thing, like churches were being built in the suburbs.
So Dara, I just want to get you back to
exactly. So anyway, I'll stop.
But wait, I think Dara just said something very important where like, this wasn't freely chosen. Like my content-less Jewish identity was not freely chosen because I did not know what the content was. You know, I think that so many Jews are kind of mocking and rejecting, and I'm just a blank Jewing themselves away from a tradition they've never been exposed to. And I think that is kind of heartbreaking, and there is a reason for this historically. Like when we kind of jammed that Protestant cookie cutter into Judaism and got rid of what didn't fit, like we're still reckoning with that legacy today. And I want to be clear, this is just, you know, many Jews do not have history in Europe. I don't want to be Ashkenormative here, but in America, many of us do. And I think there's been we're kind of reckoning with that now. And you're seeing, you know, many Jewish organizations, leaders, scholars reclaiming what we lost. But that is what we're reckoning with, and it's very big.
Dan, I just want you to just comment a little bit on, and it's not that we want to beat ourselves up, but we want to chart a different course now. Are what I would say is that the average smart Jew doesn't want to feel dumb. And all of this can be very daunting sounding. You know, you haven't read Gemara and you haven't gone back to the history of Christianity. Like, that's going to take some real commitment. And I'm not saying that, you know, I once interviewed someone who said, you know, I know plenty of Jews who learn how to play tennis in the summer and learn Italian in a year. Like, if they want to do something, they build a house in, 18 months. If you want to do something, you can commit to it. But just realistically, when you hear this, you can imagine that it's kind of coming from the people on the inside saying, come on, the water's warm. This is worth doing. But there are barriers that I think we have to be honest about.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how you slice and dice it, to become a reasonably literate Jew requires work. It's work. It's not like there's no like, you know, chat GPT, you know, summary of Judaism, although maybe there is actually, but I'm just saying it will require some work. So I think we are not being honest if we say, oh, no matter what, you can do it. It requires some work, some commitment. I think some of the models that have historically worked, which I'm a big believer in and want to invest in, shouldn't be the only models. And certainly people, like I talked in the 92nd Street Y speech, I cited some adult learning programs that came online, like came to life after October 7th. I'll tell you one of these, can you believe WhatsApp groups? The Shabbat 1 week after October 7th, I was in one of these groups and everyone's amped and everyone's, you know, those were early days, it's understandable. And then Shabbat came and someone on the chat, and the group was a big group and it was people of mixed, you know, levels of observance. And someone on the chat said, hey, let's take a break from the WhatsApp chat over Shabbat. And which was hard for anyone to, like, we got to, like, not keep hitting refresh, you know. And then he said, I mean, this was at Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, Mayor Rabbi Soloveitchik, he said, you know, Rabbi Soloveitchik teaches a class every Saturday afternoon at Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. He's one of the great Jewish scholars, and he teaches a class. You don't have to come to services in the morning. You don't have to come to services in the evening. But you can if you want. But it's just like a 1-hour class. That's the single most important thing you can do this weekend, rather than constantly hitting refresh on your WhatsApp groups and constantly going to the Times of Israel to hear the latest parade of horribles. You know, just go. And it was like, so there are places and ways to engage as an adult that doesn't require the commitment of a dual curriculum education through like your entire school years, that may not make you as literate now as Sarah is after having written 2 books on Judaism, but can definitely get you engaged with the content. And I think it's like a slippery slope in the best possible way. Because once you get a little bit of it, you're going to want more of it.
All right, we have to move on because we have to go to questions. We've got to get to Israel, which is a small topic, but it is a chapter in your book called My Search for Israel's Original Sin. So first of all, your decision to title it that, which obviously was a pre-October 7th title, am I right?
Yeah, I started this book, I've been working on this book for about a year and a half before October 7th.
And if you could just say a little bit about how you chose not to include Israel in your first book.
So, I mean, it's funny, I was talking to a Jewish communal leader after my first book came out, and I was telling her, yeah, there's chapters on Torah and on ethics and Shabbat and light and on, and she goes, and Israel? And I was like, oh, no, it's more about, like, Jewish religion, and that would be distracting. And I'm, like, hemming and hawing, and she just looks at me and she goes, well, that's a cop-out. I was like, oh. I'm like, how dare you? But, like, I also felt really busted. And the reality was, like, I really was genuinely interested and sort of captivated by those other things. But I was really uneasy about Israel, right? It kind of seemed messy and sinister. And Dan and I talked about this on his show. I mean, it's embarrassing to admit, but I really thought that if I actually did the research, if I actually studied the history of Israel, I would find some kind of terrible thing that I wouldn't be able to defend. That there would be some kind of original sin at the heart of Israel's founding that I just wouldn't be able to sell, and I just didn't want to go there. And, in this book, I was like, okay, this is a book about, I visited 27 college campuses. You can't not talk about anti-Semitism and Jewish identity now without talking about Israel. And so I just thought, like, okay, I gotta do it. I gotta search for this original sin. I have to confront it. And what was so amazing is I discovered that Israel is a country. That's actually what I discovered. It was really quite stunning. I know, it's a big shocker for me. I mean, it was founded like so many other countries in the 20th century, in a way much better founding story than I would argue our own country, America. We spend so much time on how exceptional it is, and it is, right? It's also a miracle. It's also extraordinary. It is also the greatest story ever. And it's a country. And I think we focus so much on the exceptional that
And finish the sentence, and it's a country, and therefore what?
And therefore it was founded in war, partition, bloodshed, the way countries were founded in the mid-20th century. I wish there was a better story, right? I wish I could say, like, it was founded in moonbeams and unicorns, but it wasn't, because no country is. And I think that, in our eagerness to, like, make our kids fall in love with it, we so exceptionalize it that when they get to college and learn that indeed it is a country and it did some bad things, like every country, again, they, like, lose their minds. And they feel betrayed, and then it's like, we can't trust anyone, and Judaism's bad, and they kind of have these crises, and I think we're kind of setting them up for failure. So my chapter, entitled My Search for Original Sin, is like, Israel's a country. Oh my God, its founding was like so many other countries.
Dan, before I go to Dara on this, you see that there is, particularly now, this sense that there is some kind of shame in standing with it. And I would love you to just address that. And I think it's Dara's term of weaponizing shame. But if you can really hit that head on, that this idea that I think some feel like you either are in the camp of there's nothing to apologize for, or there is, like, I'm walking away, as opposed to this middle of saying, I believe in this place and I'm wrestling with it.
So I think that immediately after October 7th, we saw the mainstream media and on college campuses, the platforming or the promoting of Jews that had a knee-jerk agenda in criticizing Israel. Now the reality, like the anti-Zionist Jews, the Jewish students who would speak at the Students for Justice in Palestine rally at Harvard University. Now, everyone started to focus on, God, we didn't realize there were so many of these. There aren't that many, actually. The numbers are tiny. It's not to say it's zero, but they are tiny.
What was tiny?
The number of Jews who were
actually
anti-Zion, like fiercely critical of Israel after October 7th. There was a tiny number, but the volume was really loud. Their voice was outsized in the conversation, so I think there was a tendency to think that there was a lot of the Jews that I'm describing. So I think immediately after October 7th, those numbers were small. What we've seen 2 years later is not Jews in large numbers that fit into that category. It's something else. It's exhaustion. It's exhaustion of having to make the case for Israel at war for 2 years, for feeling like having to explain for every policy, whether people agree with them or disagree with it. It just wore people down. And I thought the peak of that was this summer. It really rattled me because we had 3 big charges against Israel basically over the last few weeks. It was the orchestrated starvation campaign. There was no orchestrated starvation campaign. There's a human catastrophe in Gaza, as there is in every urban war zone, particularly one that has the population density that Gaza has. So we can go through all the reasons why that war zone is so bad, but there is a humanitarian catastrophe there, but there's not forced starvation. The second one was genocide. There was an orchestrated genocide, which we can get into, but it's just not true. And the third is that Israel was systematically targeting journalists, that it was trying to murder Palestinian journalists, which was also not true. And for the first time this summer, I felt like many of us were just exhausted. Like we just were tired of fighting these fights. And so those three themes really broke through. And I'm really, people say that Ben-Gurion was always concerned about Israel fighting long wars because Israel was not resourced to fight long wars, so he always wanted the wars to be short and to basically be away games, prefer not to be fighting them on your own borders. The more I think about it, my sense is he probably also realized that when Israel fights wars, it surfaces anti-Semitism, as I said at the beginning of this session. And a 2-year war is going to surface a lot of anti-Semitism. And so I think we are just exhausted by that. And
then just the fact that there is a reality of Israel as a pariah state right now in the world. How would you advise a young Jewish person who cares, who's smart, who's thinking, is reading, but feels like that's an even bigger fight now?
Yeah, I mean, I come back to what, we chose as the cold open of our podcast, our conversation with Sarah, this exact point that she made just now a moment ago. And it got a really interesting reaction because it touched a lot of our audience that are exhausted, a lot of our audience that I think is more to the left than I am. I think what she said very much resonated with them, which is to say, it's okay.
You think there's anyone to the left of you?
Can you believe it? I know, it's hard to believe. It's a little bit of space, not much. But I think what she said resonated because she was basically saying it's okay to hold these complicated views of Israel and still say, I care deeply about Israel and I care deeply, I'm unapologetically a Zionist that can say, I disagree with this policy, I think the country makes a mistake in this, but I treat Israel like I treat a family member, which is to say, family members can certainly make mistakes, but you give family the benefit of the doubt. And you try to understand, when you think they made a mistake, to try to understand what happened and try to put it in context and not just completely write them off. And so, I think that's a lot of what she says in the book and she said in our conversation. Now, what was interesting is many friends of mine to the right reacted very negatively to what she said in that cold open, because they're like, how dare she say its founding wasn't exceptional? It was absolutely exceptional. And she's completely diminishing and downplaying that. I mean, you should see these comments.
Oh my God.
I got a few of them too.
Yeah. But I thought that point was extremely important, especially for the reason you're saying, especially at this moment. It's like we don't have to tell Jews this is like a take it or leave it moment with Israel. You can say, yes, you're allowed to criticize policies of Israel, which you can hold that while saying I'm unapologetically a Zionist and believe Israel has a right to exist, and Israel has a right to defend itself from an existential threat.
I mean, I think this is the thing that I think so many people are struggling with. Yeah. I mean, I think the problem is that even if all three of those charges were true, the idea that Israel should then be dissolved is that Israel should no longer exist. That's the problem, right? The fact that you have to be like, no, this isn't true. And it's like, the fact that we have to do that is because there are so many people who are saying, thus Israel should no longer exist. And I think, my message to young people is I'm a Zionist. And here's what that means. It means that I believe that Jews have a right to safety and security in a country in their ancestral homeland. They have the same right to independence and self-determination that Japanese people have in Japan, and Latvians have in Latvia, and Palestinians, I think, should have one day in a state of their own. And we have run the counter-experiment to that, right? We ran the experiment of Jewish statelessness for 2,000 years, and it kind of went poorly. And not just the Crusades and the blood libel back in old-timey times, the 20th century, right? We all know the Holocaust, 2/3 of European Jews annihilated. Many of us don't know the 850,000 Jews in Arab lands who had to flee in the mid to late 20th century because they were brutally persecuted. Most of them went to Israel. Many people don't know 2 million Russian Jews who had to flee because they were brutally persecuted, 1 million to Israel. They don't know tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews, same story. They went to Israel. So the idea that we're going to live in a world without Israel is appalling to me. And at the same time, I abhor the current Israeli government. I abhor it. I disagree with so many of the policies, with the ideology. If you think I'm not going to criticize, you are wrong. And similarly, like, I'm an American who loves my country, is very patriotic, and I cannot stand my current president. Not hard. Many of us hold this tension really well. Okay. And I think same with Israel.
I don't understand why we have to pretend that this conversation is actually about Israel when it's not. Like, that's, like, to me, was, like, the most striking thing. Like, there's this idea that's like, oh, well, there's this slippery slope between, like, you know, criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. I'm like, there's not a slippery slope. There's a conversation about a country, and then there's abject racism. And I'm not sure why we're pretending that those two things are, like, even related to each other. The most striking thing, like, I remember, like, when I was working with this horrible committee at Harvard, you know, they're like, you know, it was just a fire hose. And this was in the fall of 23. There's this fire hose of incidents coming at us all day long. And I remember one of these incidents was these, you know, students who went into these, there was like a big walkout for a ceasefire in Gaza, where they went into all the classes with megaphones. They disrupted the classes. You know, we're all going to walk out of class for a ceasefire in Gaza. The funniest thing about this is that it happened during a ceasefire in Gaza. And it happened again in Colombia in the spring, right? There was also a walkout for ceasefire. I'm like, I have great news for you guys. There's a ceasefire in Gaza. Like, they're not interested in what's happening in the Middle East. Like, there's no, like, why are we pretending? And you talk about this in your book where you're like, it's like these medieval Jews who are like, let me explain to you why I don't bake matzah out of Christian children's blood. Like, why are, like, you being put into this position where you have to, like, do this idiotic, like, here I am in a defendant's dock? Like, no, the answer is, like, F you. Like, why are we, like, if you want to have a real conversation, like,
it's also, I mean,
if you want to have an actual conversation what's actually happening, that's great. And that's, like, the kind of places where, you know, we all know, like, amazing people who are having those conversations, like every guest on Dan's podcast, including you. But why should we pretend that that's a conversation?
It's also, you know, what I get gaslit a lot about my campus. Like, I get told what campuses are like by people who've never visited a college campus. I'm like, I visited 27 of them. Can you just at least give me the benefit of the doubt? I keep getting told, well, it's criticism of Israel that these kids are doing. They're criticizing Israel. And, like, I wish that were the case. I would love for college students, both Jewish and non-students, to be passionately and vehemently criticizing the policies and ideology of the Israeli government. That's fine. But from water to water, Palestine shall be Arab is not criticism of Israel any more than from water to water, Israel should be Jewish is. That's eliminationism, right? That's a call for a genocide. Like, that's not criticism. You know, saying that, you know, Israelis are Nazis is not criticism any more than saying Palestinians are terrorists. It's just racism. It's just bigotry. So, like, the idea that there's this, like, really profound conversation going on campus, and how dare you not, you know, want to interrupt that? I'm like, I want that conversation, but slurs and unfounded accusations are not criticism. Okay. And I think we need to name that.
Great. We're going to go to questions now.
Given the fact that Jews are not seen as a marginalized population worth protecting among young people, are you nervous about the future of what it means to be Jewish?
I mean, you've put your finger on something so astute, right? Because, like, I think the very charge against Jews is that they are diabolically powerful, right? They're just controlling everything, and they're so depraved. They're in this powerful, depraved conspiracy, and, like, I'm sorry, what, do powerful people need protection? No, right? It's like this idea, you know, there's sort of this idea that not only are Jews white, but they're like the extra white people. They're like the whitest white people, so they're the most powerful. Jews are not white. I mean, Jews are every race and ethnicity, so let's not even do that. But I do think that idea that Jews are powerful and thus sort of not entitled to protection, that's like the very nature of anti-Semitism, and it does worry me, especially when in many circles now, powerfulness itself is considered immoral. So, like, if power is immoral, then Jews thus are immoral. And if powerlessness is moral, then Jews, again, are thus immoral. And so we have this kind of bizarre mindset that really puts Jews in a very tough position. So and, like, do Jews have power? It's such an interesting question. We have a state. It has nuclear weapons. We are not powerless anymore. I want to be clear about that. But there is a difference between power and status. And I think Jews in America have a tremendous amount of status. We have cultural and professional achievements, we have wealth, you know, we have a lot of status, but power is something different. Power is the ability to protect your body at the end of the day. Like, And I think Jews in Germany back in the day had a lot of status. What it turned out they didn't have was power, and then they got killed.
Okay.
I think having Israel makes that a little bit more complicated today, but I think it's key to kind of maintain that distinction.
Okay. Marjorie, did you have somebody?
Yes, I have a question. So earlier on in the panel, the discussion was very much focused around the importance of Jewish learning to create, I suppose, Jewish continuity, Jewish depth, all that kind of thing. And in a way, maybe it's more focused to Dan, but as part of that scope of Jewish learning, how important is it, do you think, that includes an understanding amongst younger Jews about the history of Israel? Because the amount of falsification of, I mean, you can talk about critique, but there's so much lies, misinformation about Israel, and I kind of sometimes feel a younger cohort of Jews that don't know a lot get swept up into it.
Okay, so it's about
how important is learning about the history of Israel and all of that in part of this Jewishness?
I think it's extremely important. I worry that, particularly in the Jewish day school system, which I'm involved with, that we don't do enough of it, and then kids, it's like the worst of both worlds. They're in a bubble, so they're never really engaging with different points of view as it relates to Israel. Then they get to college, and they are hit with like a tsunami of different points of view when it comes to Israel, and they've never had to like develop that muscle tissue, and they haven't learned enough to be able to, and that's when you have this, what Sarah describes as this sort of like a little bit of a meltdown. So when they get to campus, because they feel like they go through this disillusionment period. So I think studying the history, I mean, I do a lot of that on my podcast, is trying to educate about the study of Israel. I will say, we all lament that, the TikTok generation, kids don't have any time to learn anything. They're not interested in really learning anything. I don't believe that. I mean, I think there's some of that, but I am struck by the podcast episodes I have done that I think are the most, they're interesting to me, but I think they're the most dull, they're the most boring, they're the most dense. A two-part podcast, two-episode podcast on the origins of the 48 War with Benny Morris. Again, interesting to me. I had no idea it would be one of our most popular podcast episode, most downloaded. Like, there's huge appetite for it, and I'm getting tons of requests from students, from college students, from high school students, for more and more and more content to learn about the history of Israel. So and by the way, I said this when Sarah and I had our conversation on my podcast. I also think you should learn the Palestinian narrative too. I'm not saying I agree with the Palestinian narrative, and I'm not saying we're going to reconcile with the Palestinian narrative, but, and I mentioned in the podcast, my son, who's a high school senior, is taking a class called Dual Narratives, where they study the history of all the major events in Israel's history from the 48 War, and they go all the way, and they study it. This is the Israeli perspective, and this is the Palestinian perspective. And what was most amazing is the course description makes clear, it's almost like I think it's a memo to the parents more than the students, says, to be clear, the purpose of this class is not to find middle ground. We're not going to bridge our differences. I mean, maybe there's some of that. That's not what this is trying to do. Because some of these differences are irreconcilable. We simply just want you to understand how the person you will encounter at some point in your life sees it. They see it differently. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. Doesn't mean you have to be persuaded by them. Doesn't mean you have to meet them halfway, but you should kind of know where they're coming from while you know where you're coming from. And I think an investment in that kind of education is extremely important.
Before we go to the next question, I just want to ask Dara, because you have spoken, I think very interestingly, sometimes counterintuitively, that Holocaust education is not a panacea against anti-Semitism. How do you feel about Israel education in terms of this kind of moment?
So in the curriculum that I've developed with this, my new nonprofit, I see these things as one story. One story. In other words, the sort of brainwave that I have is like this story, that's like the positive story about like foundations of Jewish civilization, which also includes, obviously the history of the state of Israel. And then there's like the negative story about the dynamics of anti-Semitism. What I realized in creating this, and by the way, it is a chat GPT, so I don't agree with the whole, it is like you're not going to learn this if you do 4 hours. Literally, this is like, it's like a 6 lesson thing for 9th grade. So yeah, we do actually have this. What I realized is those two things are completely inseparable. are completely inseparable, which goes to what Sarah said earlier about like, oh, the Holocaust, why the Jews were targeted, like, oh, because of scapegoating and bigotry. I actually think that there's this intimate connection between the content of Jewish civilization and the dynamic of anti-Semitism. Because if you think about the core of Judaism as monotheism, belief in one God, rejection of idolatry, in the ancient Near East, that's not a religious belief, it's a political belief. Because all these other societies in the ancient Near East have lots of gods, one of them is the dictator. So the Jews, when the Jews say they don't bow to other gods, what they're really saying is they don't bow to tyrants. And what that means is that this is an anti-tyrannical movement. And when you have an anti-tyrannical movement, it pisses off tyrants. And this is an anti-hierarchical movement. When you have that, it pisses off people who want to create a dominant society, right? When you have an anti-imperial movement, this is like, it pisses off empires. When you have an a non-conformist movement, it pisses off dominant societies that need everybody to conform, which goes to a point that you hone in on your book of like that need to conform, that ultimate pressure. So these things, to me, are inseparable. And so the way we teach this is they're completely intertwined. So we do teach about the history of Zionism, but we also have like case study about like the Durban Conference in 2001, which was this like festival of Jew hate under the name of human rights. Okay. So yes, I see these as completely inseparable.
We'll have you back when that curriculum's ready.
I will just say, I think, we've focused so much in America on Jews getting ourselves comfortable, right? Getting ourselves accepted and feeling like we didn't have to feel different. And that's beautiful. And I'm glad, right? I'm glad that in public schools we're not doing Christian prayer anymore because that leaves out Jewish students and also other like non-Christian students. But I'm just recently I've been like, did we get a little too comfortable? Like, I almost think, like, did we just think, oh, we're just, like, Americans of this slightly different ethnicity or faith? And, like, I think, Dara makes this point beautifully in People Love Dead Jews. Like, to be a Jew is to be different. It is to be uncool. It is to be countercultural. And I think in our effort to make ourselves the same and comfortable, we almost kind of undermine the purpose of Jewish existence, which is to be a challenge to the dominant ways of thinking. And so I think that's very much aligned with what you're saying.
All right, we're running out of time. Just a couple more. Ari, you're in charge there.
Hi. I'm going to move the conversation away from anti-Semitism in Israel and do more of an internal look of how you look at Judaism. I find it interesting that you guys haven't mentioned decline in religion overall in secular society as part of the reason why Jewish culture and identity and religion might also be in decline. I was wondering how you guys think about like the ethnic cultural Judaism versus the religious Judaism, and especially in conversation with Jewish day school, like where that dichotomy comes into play.
I'm going to take two others, Ari, so then we can move around. Marjorie, are you there? Yeah.
Two basic facts that haven't been discussed, one of which is that the greatest killer of Jews in the world has been assimilation, not Adolf Hitler. And the second is that in America today, statistics show that almost 50 or maybe more than 50% of Jews intermarry, and Judaism is lost frequently through their intermarriage. My question to you is, other than the intellectual Jews who are interested in Judaism, the vast majority of Jews have little or no interest, at least it's so they express it, in continuing Judaism. There is a core of us who think that Judaism is important to continue into other generations, but the vast majority don't have that feeling.
Okay. And one more over here. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I'm going to be the countercultural and uncool Jew here tonight. I just wanted to bring our attention to a word that's been used many times tonight, the word anti-Semitism, that was invented by a man who hated Jews, a man called Friedrich Wilhelm. And for the life of me, I still don't understand why we are using that word that's being used against us to make it very polite and scientific sounding, and to make it believable that there is a Semitic race.
So the question is?
Why are we still doing that?
Okay.
Thank you.
Just the question about Jewish religion, and sort of it was a complicated question, but it sort of jumped out at me, the word religion. Dara has made this point so beautifully. we are so confused about what Jews are because, as Dara has said, like Jews predate the categories that we use to separate people out in the modern world. You know, we are not just a religion. We can all reject every aspect of Jewish religion, and like all of us on this stage are still Jews, right? It's not about believing in a religion. We're not a single ethnicity. We're many ethnicities. We're not a race. You know, we are something very different. Like we are peoplehood, civilization, nation, family, tribe. I don't even know what the right thing is. And so like almost the very category of like, okay, Jewish religion versus this versus that, like all of these things were mixed together back when Jews originated. And I think it's so hard for us today to like reclaim that because we're so stuck in these categories in which we don't fit. And so people they're like, well, I'm a Jew, but I'm not a religious Jew. It's like, what? Like, it's like we're almost using a language that just doesn't fit. And I think, again, this is part of the struggle with reckoning with modernity. It's that when you decide that Judaism is a religion just like Christianity, then, you know, you might look at people, Jews in Israel and say, well, they're not practicing my religion that focuses on social justice and tikkun olam, like, so I have nothing to do with them, right? We don't share the same religion. But those people are not your co-religionists. Like, they're like your mom or your siblings. So I think just the very nature of these categories kind of don't quite fit our what Jews really are. And that is, I think, a struggle that we need to reckon with, and we need to start reclaiming what we actually are.
Okay, did you want to answer any of the other two questions?
Well, I want to speak to the point that a gentleman over there made about assimilation being, you know, sort of the number one thing.
And intermarriage.
Yes, that's always been true. That's always been true. We are, all of us who are Jews today are the descendants of people who were countercultural, people who didn't follow the trend, people who did not succumb to this vast pressure that Sarah is describing, you know, that we think that this, you know, assimilation is this choice, whereas it's like, you know, you're surrounded by this massive pressure that you don't even understand as pressure. I mean, you know, it's like you're a fish swimming in water saying, what's water? Right? And if that's the world that you live in, it's like every person here is the descendant of people who made a countercultural choice.
Because I want to leave time for book signing, I want to end with one question, which is, I don't know if any of you listened to Yehuda Kirch's podcast, but it was the big reveal that Sarah Hurwitz is in a rabbinic program to become a rabbi. And I'm just also, she's going to be ordained by the Hartman Institute. I happen to be, full disclosure, on the board. So even though I had nothing to do with you entering that program, I could not be prouder that you're going to be in the second inaugural class. Can you just leave us with that's an unexpected turn for the speechwriter of Michelle Obama?
Oh my goodness, you have no idea. My White House colleagues keep watching me like wander farther and farther away. They're like, oh, a book on Judaism. Well, at least it's still a book she's writing. And then it's like, oh, you're training to be a hospital chap? Okay, that's interesting. And then it's like, I'm sorry, you're going to be a rabbi now? But you know, Yehuda came to me and he really made the case that like, if I want to keep writing and speaking about Judaism, I should really know the tradition deeply. Like this autodidact thing I'm doing, this self-taught thing, it's fine. But I have to have so many people review everything I write because I'm not an expert. I don't have that deep, deep learning. And I think that the idea of Hartman is to really reclaim the idea of rabbi as scholar, thought leader, teacher. And he's like, you should do this. Like, this will help you continue to write your books. And I think he's really right about that. And, you know, I think we've spent so much time in the last 2 years talking about anti-Semitism, and I get it. It is so present and so hard. But like, we're not gonna end it. There's 16 million of us with an M, okay? That's the size of a city in China. We're not gonna control what billions of people think, but we can be Jews. We can be proud, passionate, inspired, committed Jews. We can make that choice, and that's what I hope we do.
Thank you, Sarah Hurwitz, for this book. Thank you, Dara Horn.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dan Senor. Thanks, all of you. Shana Tova.